the Catholic Men's Podcast, helping you find good works of literature for the Catholic gentleman. Escape from Cuba by Joseph P. Blank. The storm came to an end during the darkness of early morning. Antonio Vigo Cancio was afraid to guess how far the wild north wind might have blown them back toward Cuba. It was the 6th day of their attempted escape from the Castro regime, and their raft of 6 patched inner tubes roped together was looking flimsier than ever. Then, at dawn, came the appalling sight. In the distance, the 7 refugees detected the faint outline of the mountaintops of Cuba, perhaps 20 miles away. Antonio tried his best to think. Nothing was left of their rations but a half-dozen portions of water and 2 small cans of condensed milk. Should they go back to Cuba, land at night, try to find water and set out again? Should they chance being caught and clapped in prison? He decided against it. Veranda, his wife holding their baby, read the decision in Antonio's eyes. "You men pick up those paddles," she said. "Let's get going." Early in the Cuban Revolution, Antonio had hoped that Castro meant democracy. By 1960, he knew that Cuba had only exchanged one dictatorship for another. He became involved in a conspiracy to overthrow the government. Caught with explosives in his possession, he was sentenced to 30 years in prison. After 2 attempted escapes had cost him months in solitary confinement, he decided to become a model prisoner in the hope of earning a reduced sentence. In December 1969, after serving 9 years, he was paroled. On release, Antonio was ordered to a job as a truck driver with a federal agency that employed ex-prisoners and closely observed their behavior. After working 25 days, living in a barracks with other parolees, he was permitted to spend 5 days with his family. "We can't live like this, always watched," he said to Veranda. "We have no future here. We must leave." Veranda agreed. As a former political prisoner, Antonio wasn't eligible for the daily refugee airlift that went to Miami. The only alternative was an illegal trip across the Straits of Florida. Antonio began to consider the problem. He decided against attempting to steal or build a seagoing craft. That way, he risked arrest before he even touched water. He had to find another way. In April 1971, after parking his truck in his agency's garage one day, Antonio found himself staring at a big inner tube from a truck tire. That was it. A raft composed of inner tubes tied together and enclosed in a sheath stitched from burlap bags. A special advantage? The deflated tubes could be folded and hidden in a small space. During the next few months, Antonio stole 6 inner tubes from the garage. 2 were in fair condition, the others had to be patched. Then he found 4 hardwood boards and shaped them into paddles with a machete. His wife collected food and burlap bags. On August 17th, Antonio and Veranda assembled the raft while their 2 sons, 11-year-old Tony and 10-month-old Carlitos, looked on. Inflating the tubes by mouth took them an hour, and they felt as if their lungs were bursting. Antonio lashed the tubes into a 6-by-9-foot raft. After slipping the raft into the sheath of burlap sacks that Veranda had stitched together, the couple bounced on the tubes to test the patches under pressure. Everything held. A few days later, Antonio began his monthly 5-day leave. Checking the weather forecasts, he learned that no storms were expected along the northern coast of Cuba during the coming week. He estimated that it would take 4 to 5 days to reach the shipping lanes off Florida, where he hoped to be picked up by a passing cargo vessel or fishing boat. He had his crew: Luis, his wife's brother, Silvio, her cousin, Julio, a friend of the family. He had a compass, a toy-like giveaway that had come with a bottle of vermouth. Everything was ready. On the afternoon of departure, young Tony asked his mother, who had been silent for hours, "Mima, "Are you thinking of the trip?" When she nodded, he said, "Well, only 3 things can happen. We'll get caught, which is the worst thing. Or we'll die, but we'll die as a family. Or we'll arrive safely, which will mean happiness." She hugged him. Shortly before 7 that evening, a friend arrived in a truck. Antonio loaded it at a casual pace to avoid attracting attention, and the family climbed aboard. After picking up Luis, Silvio, and Julio, they drove to the launching site, a narrow, uninhabited stretch of sand called Hollywood Beach, about 25 miles east of Havana. Silently, the men carried the equipment and supplies to the water's edge, then began blowing up the tubes. When, at last, the group climbed aboard, the raft sank lower in the water than Antonio had anticipated. As the men started paddling toward Key West, 90 miles to the north, everyone on the raft soon became wet to the waist. Antonio had no charts, no open sea experience. By day, he intended to navigate by compass, at night by the North Star. The 4 men sitting cross-legged or with their legs dangling in the water paddled rhythmically for 6 hours. Then Silvio and young Tony got violently seasick, and Julio's arms gave out. After 24 hours, Antonio remained the only consistent paddler. The refugees were now developing painful sores on their hips, thighs, and legs. The men suffered from continual friction with the burlap as they paddled, and Veranda from her writhing, restless 28-pound baby. Her arms felt almost dead from trying to control and provide shade for the seemingly tireless infant. At about noon on the 3rd day, a freighter hove into sight several miles away. "We're saved," Silvio shouted. "Wait," Antonio ordered. "Get under the mosquito netting." The raft's supplies included blue-tinted netting for camouflage, and now, as they floated haphazardly, Antonio stared hard at the freighter. When it plowed a few hundred yards closer, he spotted the red and white funnels that identified it as a Soviet vessel. For a long quarter-hour, the group cowered silently beneath the netting, while the freighter slowly disappeared in the distance. Later that night, Antonio found that food and water were being consumed faster than expected, and he began rationing for all hands except the baby, Carlitos. He also discovered, to his dismay, that salt water had killed the flashlight batteries and ruinously corroded the mirror that he'd brought for flashing signals. On the afternoon of the 5th day, the sky darkened and a brisk north wind began stirring up whitecaps. It was the kind of wind Antonio had secretly dreaded from the outset. The raft was now being inexorably blown back toward Cuba. The waves deepened, lightning flashed, and rain slashed down, ruining the remaining bread and sugar. Hour after hour, the little group merely clung to the raft, and then, with the arrival of dawn, came the disheartening sight of the Cuban mountaintops. Shortly after the decision against returning to the island for water was made, a good south wind sprang up to push the raft away from Cuba. The men paddled, rested, and paddled again. By the end of the day, the rationed water for the adults was finished, though a little remained for the baby. Luis was shaking with fever. With the next dawn came a cloudless blue sky, and soon the sun blazed down on them. They reached into the water for seaweed and chewed on the buds. Sometimes, in a tangled mass of seaweed, they found tiny half-inch crustaceans, which they popped into their mouths, chewed once, and swallowed. Antonio tried to conceal his anxiety about his wife. Her bloodshot eyes were sunken, her lips deeply cracked, her blouse virtually torn off her back by the baby's frenzied clawing as he screamed from thirst. The salt water had irritated the infant's skin, and he scratched himself until the blood ran. Then on the 9th day, there was a fearful change. Now the baby lay mercifully quiet, too quiet. Periodically, Veranda shook him, or Antonio reached over to play with his hand. The infant would open his eyes, gaze vacantly for a moment, then return to sleep. Except for Antonio, the crew was apathetic. Thirst and weakness were destroying them. but Antonio firmly believed that they were nearing their destination. Aircraft frequently passed across the sky 6 or 8 miles to the east, and each time he pleadingly waved his paddle with a diaper tied to it. Early on the 11th day, Antonio was alerted by a change in the air. He smelled sweet water. Somewhere to the east it was raining, and the wind was blowing rain clouds in their direction. "It's going to rain," he shouted exultantly. "Luis, you and Julio grab a plastic bag and catch water. When the rain starts, everybody turn your face up and catch water in your mouth." Rain drenched them for about 10 minutes. No one spoke. Each was savoring the delicious luxury of fresh water. After the clouds passed, Veranda filled an 8-ounce bottle for the baby and let him drink half of it. He screamed for more, but his mother set aside the remainder, knowing it should be reserved for the end of the day. Although Antonio insisted that they had to be approaching the end of their terrible passage, the other men couldn't share his optimism. They had depended on his judgment for freedom. Now, in their shattered mental state, they blamed him for their despair. During the night, a rainless storm tossed the raft. Fearful of losing a passenger overboard, Antonio shouted, "Everybody awake! Use your paddle! Sit up straight!" Then, around 4 a.m., the wind died. The waves grew shallow and stars twinkled. Not too far away, Antonio saw moving lights. "That's a boat!" he cried. More lights peeped out of the night. "Boats! We're going to be saved! Everybody paddle!" The 4 men screamed for help, but their pleas went unheard. "It doesn't matter," Antonio reassured them. "There are many boats out there. As soon as day comes, they'll see us." The men somehow found strength, and as they paddled, suddenly out of the dark gray dawn, about 200 yards away, loomed the gigantic shape of an oil tanker, the Key Trader from Wilmington, Delaware. It moved slowly toward the refugees as Antonio shouted and waved a diaper. Then, with bells suddenly clanging and red lights flashing, the tanker came to a halt. Antonio and Silvio paddled the raft to within 20 yards of the ship. A voice from the deck shouted in English, "Who are you?" "We are Cubans," Antonio replied. "We have escaped. We've been at sea for 12 days. A rope dropped from the tanker's deck. Antonio grabbed it and pulled alongside. On the raft, the others were chattering hoarsely, for the most part incoherently, and trying to embrace one another. In a few minutes, a flexible ladder was lowered from the deck. Veranda touched her husband and said, "The baby." He picked up Carlitos and, incredibly, climbed the ladder with the infant clutched in one arm. At the gunwale, a sailor took the baby from him. Antonio was helped to the deck, where he collapsed. Veranda watched her husband and baby disappear into the safety of the ship. In her numb, near unconscious condition, she wasn't capable of feeling joy or triumph. "We've gotten through," she murmured to herself. "We are there." End of Escape from Cuba by Joseph P. Blank. Thanks for listening, and Godspeed.